Doctors who argue that women should be marrying earlier, before puberty. Women would also have been very involved in religion. There are certain Greek women who win Olympic prizes. Hi, I'm Honor Cargill-Martin. I am a classicist and I'm here today to answer the most Googled questions about ancient Greek women. So, first question. Was Helen of Troy real? So Helen of Troy is a legendary figure. She's meant to be the most beautiful woman in the ancient Greek world, and she appears in the narrative of the Great Trojan War. And she comes down to us for the first time in writing in the works of Homer around 800 BC. And she is meant to be half mortal, half god. She is the daughter of the Spartan queen Leda and the god Zeus. And in some of the stories, she actually hatches out of a swan's egg. There are debates about how much of the narrative of the Trojan War was potentially based in reality that was passed down in oral tradition. So it's possible that Helen was based originally on some Mycenaean princess from the Bronze Age, but she probably did not hatch out of a swan's egg. Next question. Who was the most famous Greek woman? I would have to say probably Sappho, who is a incredibly famous poet. She writes in lyric poetry, around 600 BC, and she is from the island of Lesbos. Her main theme is love. She writes about all of its eroticism, all of its emotion, the jealousy, the desire, and she is incredibly famous in the Greek world. She's known among Greek writers as the 10th muse, so the 10th goddess of artistic production. She appears on pottery, on people's wall paintings. So she's a real icon to the Greeks, and a lot of people essentially copy her style of poetry, and the meter that she writes in comes to be known as the Sapphic meter. And her works continued to be copied and read even after antiquity. We have fragments of them now, and of course she's also famous to us because a lot of her poems are written from the point of view of a woman who is having a love affair or is desiring another woman, and so the name Sappho and her birthplace Lesbos have come to be the words that we use for lesbian and sapphic. So next question, did Athenian democracy include women? Absolutely not. Women in Athens cannot vote, they cannot hold political office, they cannot attend the assemblies, they cannot even kind of represent themselves or appear in court. And one of the ways that Athenian democracy functions so well is because it defines the male citizen body in contrast to outsiders, so in contrast to foreigners, in contrast to slaves, and in contrast to women. It's interesting and quite ironic that we perceive Athens to be the birthplace of just rule and political rights, when really it was a very oppressive regime for the vast majority of people who lived there. Next question. So could Greek women vote? So we've just established they couldn't vote in Athens, and in fact I can't think of a single place in Greece that they could vote. But it is important to remember that the Greek world is made up of all these different kingdoms and city-states that all have their own forms of rule. Some of them are democracies, some of them are oligarchies, so ruled by the wealthy, some of them are tyrannies or monarchies. In some of those political systems, women would have been able to exert more power. So for example, if you have a monarchical system, the women who are within the king's family might be able to exert a lot of unofficial political power, but they won't be able to vote. Next question, were Greek women involved in politics? So we've covered this to some extent. Women generally couldn't vote, and in certain city-states like Athens, they were entirely politically sidelined. In monarchies, they could have a lot more power through influencing the men around them, but again, that is going to be limited to a very small number of women. As you get into later Greek history, there is more evidence of wealthy women being kind of honored by their city. So we sometimes get women being given actually magistracies as a sort of reward for making big donations to civic funds. And there's just a lot more evidence of women being kind of involved in that civic side of life. Next question. Did the Spartans respect women? This is such an interesting question. So the Athenian writers who write about Sparta and who sadly make up the majority of our sources really focus on what is so different between Athens and Sparta. And one of the things that they notice is that the Spartans treat their women very differently. And the Athenians obviously think that this is quite shocking. So the Spartans encourage young women to take part in kind of physical activity, in races, in singing, in performances. And then later on, the Spartan women are still allowed to own property, they're allowed to inherit, they're allowed to, seemingly exert quite a lot more power in the society. Does that necessarily translate to the Spartans respecting women in the way that we would understand today? Their main role was still procreation and marriage. So one of the key reasons that the Spartans are encouraging young girls to kind of train in physical activity is because they want them to be strong, because the belief is if the mother is strong, she is going to birth a strong son who is going to become a strong soldier for the Spartan state. That being said, we do have a lot of evidence of Spartan women exerting a lot of political power, and there are also instances in which a Spartan community will honor a woman for some achievement. So there's a woman called Kyniska, who is the first woman to achieve a victory at the Olympic Games by sponsoring a charity team. After her victory, the Spartans actually set up essentially a hero shrine to her in the center of the town. We found inscriptions honoring her. And so there suddenly is, I think, more of a respect for women's possible achievements. So because there are these very different kind of outlooks on women's roles in society, a lot of these questions are going to have different answers depending on what part of Greece you're looking at. So next question, could Greek women leave the house? This is such an interesting question, and it's actually still an ongoing matter of scholarly debate. There is certainly an ideal, at least in Athens, that women will live a life that is secluded. That they will ideally remain within the domestic sphere, that they won't be seen by people outside the home. There's even an idea in Athens that to mention a woman's name in a public space is to cast aspersions on her character and her respectability. Whether that ideal was borne out in real life is a completely different question. When we look at, for example, Athenian comedy, there is an assumption made that women will have friends throughout the city, that they will be kind of socializing and going on errands. That's, again, not necessarily reflective of reality, but we might imagine that the truth for the vast majority of women at least lay somewhere in the middle. Of course, not leaving the house is also a privilege of the upper classes. If you are a very wealthy woman who has, for example, slaves to go and collect the water from the well or go and make purchases for you, that's fine. You maybe can stay at home if that is something that is expected of you. But if you are a poorer woman who has to undertake those errands herself, or who has to potentially leave the house to work, you're not going to have that same dubious privilege. So next question, did Greek women wear togas? So the toga is actually a Roman form of dress, and it is associated primarily with Roman men, although interestingly, it's also allegedly sometimes worn by prostitutes and adulteresses in Rome. But it's actually not a form of dress that appears in the Greek world at all. Instead, Greek women would have been wearing a type of kind of draped dress, and there are lots of different types that are worn in different parts of Greece. And then they would also wear a kind of cloak, and very often when they left the house, they would be expected to be veiled. It was a sign of your modesty and your respectability. Did Greek women wear makeup? Yes, they did. And we know this from both the literary sources and from the archaeology. So we have found small little Greek pots with the remnants of types of makeup inside. So for example, there's white lead that women seem to have been using for their complexions, and then ochre, which they seem to have been using as a sort of blush. It's really interesting how makeup is treated in the literary sources. It's often men kind of railing against women, wearing all this makeup, like they look so much better natural, how could they do this to themselves? And there is also an association of makeup with potentially courtesans, or with older women who are still trying to hang on to a sexual desirability. That's a kind of classic joke in Greek comedy. Next question, could Greek women go to the theatre? Again, this is a point of endless scholarly debate. Whenever Greek sources talk about the audience at the theatre, they refer to them as men. But that's not necessarily conclusive evidence that women weren't also involved. It could also just be a convention that when there's a mixed group, you talk to them as men. So in Athens, the activity of going to the theatre is seen as a moment of kind of political communal bonding. And if that's the aim, obviously it's going to be men who are really intended to be going, because that is the political community. And a lot of these events are kind of civic, religious events. That's when plays are generally performed. So we might expect that performances would have been made mainly to an audience of men, but we can't say so for certain. So did men play women in the theatre? Yes, they absolutely did. Women would not have been on the Greek stage. That's not such a problem because all the actors in a Greek play would have been wearing masks and costumes. So it was easy for them to take on those roles. Next question. What age did Greek women marry? This is such an interesting question because a lot of Greek writers discuss it and debate what the kind of correct age for a woman to enter into marriage is. It seems likely that among aristocratic women in particular, the age of marriage is essentially around puberty. So kind of 12, 13, 14. A lot of writers disagree with that. So there are certain philosophers who argue that women should marry around 18 or around 20 when they're more mature, they're more developed morally. There's actually a group of doctors who argue that women should be marrying earlier, before puberty, because they think that it's actually dangerous for a woman who has reached puberty not to be having sex, that it can cause her to go mad. So they think it's better to get it out of the way before that. Next question. Could Greek women choose their husbands? So certainly in Athens, the marriage is a contract almost entirely between the two men. So between the father and the husband. Also, if women are marrying very young, they're kind of in their early teens, their ability to push back against familial pressure in that sense is going to be very limited. There are some areas of Greece where it does seem, particularly at some periods of time, that if a woman had been married and had, divorced or her husband had died and she was a little older, she had maybe some resources of her own, she had more control over choosing her later husbands, not at Athens, but in places like Sparta and in some of the Hellenistic kingdoms. For example, we have a lot of marriage contracts from Hellenistic Egypt, which is like Greek-ruled Egypt, where it is much more kind of framed as a contract between man and woman rather than a contract between husband and father. Next question. Could Greek women divorce? Yes. Almost universally throughout the ancient world, divorce is a completely accepted event. Both parties can initiate it. It's very easy to initiate. It's just that the husband will send the wife from the house, or the wife will leave the house and usually return to the house of her father. Those are the laws, but it does seem probably more likely that in general, divorce was something that was initiated, particularly at Athens, more by the husband than by the wife. Certainly that's what our evidence would suggest. But it's not something that seems to carry huge social stigma. Next question. What age do Greek women have children? Marriage in the Greek world really is for the purposes of procreation. That is written into the marriage contracts. And so as soon as you're married, you probably would have been expected to start having children. And of course, the forms of birth control are not very reliable. So again, it would have been potentially hard to prevent even if you'd wanted to. So women would probably have been starting to have children in their teens and keeping having children until they reached the end of childbearing age. Next question. Did Greek women breastfeed? Some of them did. There is also a culture where elite women will send their children out to wet nurses. And there are debates among the doctors, particularly over whether that's a healthy thing to do, and whether that's good for mother and baby. But yeah, breastfeeding was practiced by some mothers. It was sometimes outsourced to poorer women. Could Greek women own property? This is a question that is going to receive wildly different answers depending on where you are in Greece, when you're asking it. So in Athens, women absolutely cannot own property. All their property is essentially controlled by their husband or their father. They can't even undertake transactions that are worth more than essentially the amount of barley that you need to feed a family for 6 days. So really they are incredibly limited in their financial abilities. But that's not true at Sparta. Women can own property. They can dispose of it generally how they want to. The Athenians estimate that about 2/5 of all of Spartan property is owned by women, and a lot of Spartan women become very wealthy and use that wealth either to get involved in politics or, like Kyniska, who won at the Olympic Games, to kind of fund their own interests. So for her it was chariot racing, which was a famously expensive pursuit. Women also seem to have been able to own property in lots of other smaller Greek city-states. So there's a place called Gortyn that we have an incredibly well-preserved legal code from. Women can own property there. They can own property suddenly in, say, Hellenistic Egypt, and we have lots of contracts where women are, engaging in economic activity from there. Next question. Could Greek women inherit? Again, just like property, this is going to depend where you are. Spartan women can inherit, they can in Gortyn, they can in a lot of the Hellenistic kingdoms. They absolutely cannot in Athens. So in Athens, you have this really horrible situation where the woman can be essentially a conduit of property, but she cannot own it in her own right. So if a man dies and his only child is a daughter, she becomes an heiress, but she cannot accept that bequest in her own right. So there is a legal situation where she is forcibly married off to her closest paternal male relative, usually an uncle, in order to ensure that that inheritance remains within her father's family. Next question. Could Greek women be queens? Again, it absolutely depends on what part of Greece you're in. There are some areas of Greece that are run as monarchies, particularly after the rise of Alexander the Great. He is followed by these kind of big Hellenistic monarchies that are ruling really large areas. And women in those societies very often become incredibly powerful, either as the wives or the mothers of the kings. And we have lots of stories about their political influence, their political machinations, sometimes their political murders, or them, for example, taking power during a regency while their husband or their son is away fighting. So you might have heard, for example, of Queen Gorgo in Sparta, who is said to have had a huge influence on Leonidas, to have kind of ruled in his stead when he was away fighting. You might also have heard of Olympias, who is the mother of Alexander the Great. And when Alexander leaves to go on his campaigns, there is this kind of power struggle between Olympias and the regent that Alexander has left behind. And she, in quite a few situations, does seem to come out on top. So did Greek women fight in wars? Generally, no. Fighting was intended to be the domain of men. But that sort of breaks down when you get to a situation where a city, for example, is under siege. There are certain stories in Greek history of women fighting to protect their homes and their families. And there are also obviously myths about female fighters. So you might have heard of the Amazons, who were believed to be this legendary race of women who, it was like an all-female society, and they were incredibly good fighters. They were the daughters of the god of war Ares, and they used these kind of double-edged battle axes and were incredibly feared in Greek mythology. It's possible that those were actually based on some reports of real women who were living in Scythia on the kind of Russian steppes, and who were potentially much more involved in fighting and in horsemanship than most of the women in Greece were. Could Greek women read? This is a very hard question to assess. It's famously hard to assess literacy rates in the ancient world in general, and we have a lot less evidence for women's education than we do for men, because obviously treaties are written on how you're meant to educate boys. There's much less concern about how you educate girls because they're not meant to be taking a public role in the life of the city-state. That being said, there is evidence that some women could read. It would probably have been down to the discretion of the family, how much they wanted to educate their daughters, whether it was going to be simply kind of for domestic duties or whether they would also be educating them in more literary pursuits. Also, if you're going to be running a big and a rich household, it's going to be very useful for you to be able to read and write, just simply for kind of things like practical things like making accounts, shopping lists even. And then when we move into later periods of Greek history, we get much more evidence of women being able to write. We have a number of female poets. We've mentioned Sappho. There's a woman called Corinna. There are a number of female Hellenistic epigrammists. And so those women suddenly were able to read and write and participate in that literary culture. Next question, did Greek women have an education? We kind of discussed this when we were talking about reading, but Greek women suddenly, all of them would have been educated in the management of a household. And there are certain texts that argue that the management of a household should be treated like a science. There are also philosophical schools that argue that women should be given a proper philosophical education, and they usually justify that by saying that it is going to make them more moral, make them better wives. But they're still advocating for, really kind of serious education for women. We also have evidence for certain women being educated for particular jobs. Suddenly, when we get down into the later Greek period, we have a lot of inscriptions talking about female doctors. Very often, they had been the daughters of doctors and they were trained in their father's craft. And we even have inscriptions from city-states that are honoring these women for the kind of exceptional knowledge that they have in the medical arts. Next question, did Greek women have jobs? So we've just talked about Greek doctors. Those would probably have been at the higher end of the kind of jobs you could be doing as a woman. Most female jobs would probably have been, to some extent, an extension of female work within the house. So there would have been women who were wet nurses, women who would have taken in laundry. There's a lot of evidence for women making money and actually being incredibly economically valuable as weavers and kind of dyers of cloth. That's seen as being a real kind of domain and art form for women, and all women would have been taught to weave. Also, in places where women can own property, they could have managed those estates. So yeah, there is evidence of women working and being very economically independent. Next question, what did Greek women do in their spare time? This is a hard question to answer, and it's not one that we have a huge amount of information about, particularly because all of our written sources come generally from men. The joke in Greek comedy is that all women like doing is gossiping, talking about sex. There's no reason to believe that they didn't enjoy doing that, but there would have been other activities open to them too. So weaving was seen not just as a job, but also as kind of a real art form. Other women obviously wrote or read poetry or sung. We have images on Greek pots of women kind of reading scrolls or playing the lyre. So it's possible they were doing all of that. Women would also have been very involved in religion, and that's actually one space where women have a very legitimate and acknowledged role in the civic life of their cities. And a lot of those religious duties would have been quite enjoyable in a lot of ways. Women would have been involved in the planning of these big festivals, and they would have then, enjoyed those festivals. Some of them were all female. They involved feasting, they involved dancing, they involved kind of unknown rituals that the men weren't allowed to be party to. And so I think that would also have been a space for women to express themselves and to have fun in certain aspects. Next question, did Greek women compete in the Olympics? So the Olympics is, the competitors are all men. But there are some Greek women who win Olympic prizes. And the way they do it is that they own and train chariot teams. And so for the chariot racing, the Olympic prize goes not to the charioteer, but to the trainer of the horses, because that is seen to be where the majority of the work and the skill goes into the win. And so there are a number of women who win in this space. So the first one we've mentioned is Kyniska, who is the Spartan princess. She wins the Olympic victory and she sets up this incredible monument to herself in the middle of Olympia. It's a statue of her chariot, the horses, it's a statue of herself, and it's this inscription saying, I'm Kyniska, I'm a Spartan princess, I am the first woman ever to win a victory here. There are also athletic contests that are only for women. So there is a race called the Heraia, which is in honor of Hera, and all the runners in that would have been women. Did Greek women drink wine? Again, I think you're going to see here probably quite a big distinction between what is the ideal and what is the reality. Respectable women in Greece, certainly in Athens, are not meant to be drinking wine. The Athenian Symposium, which is the sort of famous Athenian drinking party, is not open to respectable women at all. The guests are going to be all men and then hetairae, who are courtesans. That does not mean that all respectable women were not drinking wine in other situations. A lot of jokes in Greek comedy center on women loving wine. Also, one of my favorite Greek pots ever shows a woman who has kind of gone to the store cupboard in her house to get some kind of domestic things, and she is taking a big swig of the kind of jug of wine on her way back. Next question. Did Greek priestesses do drugs? I think where this comes from is there is this oracle at Delphi, and she is a priestess who is said to give kind of oracular prophecies straight from the god Apollo. And there is a theory that the way in which she got into the trance-like state in which she would give her prophecies is because she would sit on top of this crack in the earth that gave off essentially psychedelic fumes. And so she'd be incredibly high, and then she would give these riddle-like prophecies that people would then have to interpret. And they very often interpreted them badly, and that led to historical disaster. That, I think, has been generally disproven. Sadly, I wish it were true. I'm really glad that we have brought up oracles, though, because they play an incredibly important role in Greek history. They would have been consulted before any major event, a war, a change in regime. And it's really interesting that you get these kind of men being sent from all over Greece to consult this woman who is sitting in a temple giving oracular responses. Especially at Delphi, that woman was not an elite priestess. She was actually chosen from among the kind of normal people of the town. Next question. Were there any Greek gender equality movements? The concept of gender equality was just not something really that existed in the Greek world. We suddenly have instances of women fighting for their own place in society, but that tends to be quite a personal endeavor. So, for example, Olympias fighting for her kind of ability to rule over Macedonia. There's no sense that she is doing that on behalf of women more generally. There are certain philosophers who argue for much more female equality, but they are really seen as being, quite niche. They are not in the mainstream of the discourse about gender in Greece. We do also see Greek gender roles being questioned to some extent on the Greek stage. So there are tragic heroines who kind of bemoan their fate as a woman and argue that they should have had more agency. And there are lots of comedies based around the idea of women taking over control of the state. So there is Lysistrata, which is written by Aristophanes, and he also writes a play called Assembly Women. And both of them are predicated on the idea that women are taking control of politics. And characters in those plays make arguments for women having more say in the running of the state. But ultimately, they are placed within a comedic context. And the idea is always, in the end, that this is a kind of interesting thing to watch because it is so ridiculous. That's it. That's it. So that's the last question. Thank you so much for watching. I so hope that you enjoyed this. Like and subscribe. Stay tuned on the channel for more historical content. And I will be doing another Most Googled Questions on ancient Roman women if you're interested in that.